Good evening, my friends. We'll get started in a few. Almost 9 o'clock, 2 minutes to 9. We've got some exciting times happening. The American Revolution has begun. The first official shots. We'll just give everybody a couple minutes and we'll not even another minute and a half we'll get rolling. What a day. I hope everyone got out at least a little bit today. Not a great day. Tomorrow, I guess, is going to be in the 50s. Hopefully, might get a little bit of sunshine out there. I just saw another good current event. I'm going to write it down so I don't forget. All right. Well, I want to get a lot of reading done tonight, so I'm going to get started. It's 9 o'clock on the dot here. Let's see. We left off yesterday. Adam had just met a new friend. He ran out of the smokehouse and ran into the woods and saw a couple redcoats, jumped over a stone wall and took off running. And when he got to the other side of a meadow, he met a new friend who was hiding there behind another stone wall. This gentleman, Solomon Chandler, who he says is very tall but old. I think he said he was 61 years old. And Solomon is taking Adam around, gave him some food, and then brought him to a vantage point where they could look down on the British. And he told Adam, "We're going to wait. This isn't the time. He's kind of knows the weakness of the British, and we're going to let them, with all their heavy packs and their 15-pound gun, and they've been marching all night. So we're going to wait. And when we got him in the right spot, we're going to hit him." So that's where we left off. We came to a lane that runs north and south from Lincoln Town to Concord Road, and I remembered how, only the autumn before, Father and I had been out hunting in the hours after dawn. I shot 2 fat rabbits south on the lane, and were nigh freezing to death when we got to cousin Joshua Dover's house in Lincoln. And there it was for the first time that I had a good drink of hot rum, beat up with butter and sugar. Rum, butter, and sugar. Yikes. That must have been a little bit sweet. The day before this, I could remember nothing about Father but the birchings and the anger and his sarcasms. It was curious that how I recalled so many good things and discovered that the bad things were not so bad after all. Today, as we reached the lane, which was sometimes called the Lincoln Lane and sometimes the Indian Trace, we saw 9 men walking up from the south, all of them with guns and sober faces. We waited there in the lane for them. Some of them I knew by sight. One was cousin Joshua Dover. Another was his 19-year-old son, Matthias. They grinned when they recognized me, and then they saw from my face that something bitter and sad had happened. We would have our Thanksgiving dinners usually together with the Dovers and the Simonses, and with the family of Mother's brother, Simon Hatch. So I knew the Dovers well enough. Matthias Matthias took me out with my bird gun the very first day I used it and instructed me on how to load and prime it. He was a heavy, slow moving person, but kind and soft in speech, just as his father was. His father had studied for the pulpit, but given it up later in life over his grandfather's store and flour mill. Yet he kept on studying and had the reputation of being an honest Hebrew scholar in Middlesex County. I had heard father say that he maintained the correspondence with ministers all over New England, and that he was the most consulted man in the colonies when it came to the subtle and confusing interpretations of text, and had been even made a number of journeys to Providence to check his facts against old scrolls that the Jews kept there. When he saw the expression on my face, he went straight to me, took me by the arms. Solomon Chandler, meanwhile, explaining the circumstances of our meeting and something about what had happened. Your father, Cousin Dover asked. They shot him down dead. I didn't cry. I was finished with that. I felt cold and bleak, but I also felt that whatever I did from here on would be done because I willed it so, not because I was a boy who couldn't control his emotions. I think you had best tell them about it. Hard as it is, Adam, Solomon Chandler said. So I told them the story again, but more shortly now, and harder and crisper with the things that had happened. I was angry now. It was a slow thing, this beginning of anger inside me, and it was not until afterwards that I knew what was happening and growing and curdling. When I finished, there was a silence as heavy as sorrow, and no movement or motion but the pressure of Cousin Dover's arm around my shoulder. Just the silence in the pretty country lane, with the bees humming about their spring work and the birds singing in the west and sighing, and faint, ever so faint in the distance, the rattle of British drums. They absorbed it and digested it, and then they composed themselves to do it and mix their horror and anger and indignation. Then they asked questions with quite uncertainty of people visiting the home of a friend who had died. How many of our people were slain? I don't know. Can you guess, boy? Maybe 8, 10, 20? There's no way for me to tell. Do you know some for certain? Some. What were their names, boy? Caleb Harrington, his son Jonathan, Jonas Parker, he was our militia leader, Samuel Hodley, and my father. Maybe the Reverend was slain, I'm not for sure. Their faces became even harder, and one of the two of them rubbed their eyes and stared at the ground. You're sure there was no provocation from us? I saw none. Our guns weren't cocked. Father and the Reverend, they insisted that the guns not be cocked, and that would prevent accidents from happening. So they stated it. No matter now, another said. It's the finishing now. Is the news off to Waverly? Simon Chandler asked. We sent a rider off with the first gunfire. Where's the assembly, Solomon? Asked Cousin Dover. Where we planned for it, south of the Millbrook Fork in Ashley's pasture. So come along, I say, come along. 11 of us now. We marched on, following the cow track that led from the lane to Atkins' farm. At the farm, there were Levi Atkins and his brother Seth, his father, old Moses Atkins, and the 4 Atkins boys. They were armed and ready, and apparently they'd been waiting a long while for the men from Lincoln Town. Now there were 18 of us. We cut through the Hancock woods towards the Millbrook. When we came out of the woods, I would have cried with joy, for there were Cousin Simmons and the Reverend and Tom Dover. I don't know how I can explain what that meant to me. It doesn't make much sense for me to say that after what had happened on the common, I had the feeling that the whole village had died. Not only the dead men who lay on the common, but the whole village dead and gone, and never again to be the way it was. It was a heavy and sad feeling, combining with the loss of my father, the loss of everyone else who was dear to me. When I saw Cousin Simmons and the others from home, that broke and went away. And without shame or care for who was watching, I threw myself into his big arms and let him hold me as tight as if I was a little shaver and he my own father. Then I thought he'd break my ribs, the way he clutched me in those blacksmith arms of his. When he let me go, I saw that the tears were pouring down his cheeks. God be praised, he said. That people who were with me watched respectfully. We were not used to war and death in those days. We were plain people, and nothing like this had ever happened before. Solomon Chandler took off his hat, shook his hands with the Reverend, and suggested that this would be an appropriate time for some sort of benediction. The Reverend wiped his eyes and nodded. Those wearing hats removed them, and the Reverend said quietly, "For thy everlasting mercy, Almighty God, we thank thee." Oh, I am parched tonight. Then the hats went back on, and we struck out for Ashley's pasture. I heard one of the men from Lincoln comment that it was a short, peculiar benediction, and that he didn't think much of a preacher who couldn't draw some moral out of the events of today. But I guess the Reverend could be exhausted. He had been through a lot, and I know that he had always been fond of me, even though I once overheard him telling Mother that when it came to plain, downright intelligence, I couldn't hold a candle to my younger brother Levi. We were 21 strong when we reached Ashley's pasture, and there were over 30 men already and waiting for us. And while we remained there, during the next hour, men kept coming into the town by ones, by twos, by threes, and eventually there were at least 100 of us gathered there. They had several breakfast fires going. The first thing Solomon Chandler and other smokers did was got their hot coals so they could start their pipes. While the Reverend never actually came out and condemned smoking as part of the devil's witchery, he did not. He did take a very dim view of the practice. No one in our home had ever smoked. However, when Solomon Chandler offered me a draw of his pipe, I didn't refuse. I guess it was that morning that I became a smoker. The midday. The Reverend never let Sunday go by without imploring his congregation to fear God, and that was one of the matters I used to brood upon as part of the passing of time in church. I don't think that anyone with a fairly honest recollection of his childhood will fail to admit that time passes more slowly at meeting than anywhere else, unless perhaps, as I've heard some say, in jail. And one of the things that always plagued me in church was that no matter how hard I worked at it, I couldn't trustfully say that I feared God. The way I saw it, he simply did not rate with father or mother or darkness or the witch's house behind the meeting house or the schoolmaster or old Gideon Fail who hated children so much he always whacked away at them with his stick when they came within reach. Not with any of them as an object to be feared. If we had been high church, like some of our more distant relatives in Boston, and had prayed to an impersonal and elegant God, I might have come to the proper attitude. But the Reverend clung to Jehovah as the proper name of what he softly and lovingly would describe as the Ancient of Days. And somehow or another, the name Jehovah invoked no menace at all. If one of Mother's seafaring relatives had turned up and had been introduced to me as Jehovah Hatch, I would have considered it natural and not impious. Also, I once overheard Father and the Reverend discussing this very matter, and Father leaned to the opinion that our race, meaning Presbyterians, and some Congregationalists, and some Quakers, but mostly Presbyterians, were not afraid of God, but of women. We have established the new matriarchy, he said, and that led me to Granny for an explanation of what the word meant. It means your father never grew up, she said, but then went on to explain it properly. I subsequently decided that it was a good idea. It was a good deal of truth in what Father said. In any case, I've never seen, seen men really relaxed unless they were in a position secure from intrusion by women. No matter how hard and bad their case might be, they took it as a holiday. And even though what had happened in our town cast a pall over everyone at Ashley's pasture, the evil tidings of the massacre could not wholly dissipate the feeling among the people. Something had happened, and more would happen, but here it was, in between, in the April sunshine, as a balmy and sweet day as Massachusetts had ever known. I felt aggrieved at first that they were not weeping with me in my sorrow. But when I remembered what Solomon Chandler had said and tried to comfort myself with the fact that life continued, I was beginning to understand, though vaguely, that it must continue even if our common was to become the common of every town in Middlesex. The men were all in groups of relatives and neighbors, some of them toasting bacon over the fires, some cleaning their weapons, some just sprawled out comfortably and chatting. Many of them stopped to say a kind word to me as I passed among them. Here and there, and increasingly so, were men from home who had stood with me through the night on the common. I was amazed at how many were alive and turning up here, for somehow I had had the impression that most of them had been slain in the first fire. Plainly, this was not the case. From what I heard listening to this group and to that one, there were 6 assembly points spotted between the Monotony Road and the Watertown Road. That was to give the committeemen gathered at these various points the freedom to move north or south, depending on what road they had to cover. Meanwhile, the committeemen from west of the Sudbury River and west of the Concord River would converge on the North Bridge to hold the western bank of the river there. The British would reach Concord if they had not reached it already, but they would go no further. And after what had happened at the Common, some of the men maintained that it would be just as well if the British remained there. More and more I began to understand an amazing piece of organization my father and the other committeemen had carried out. It was true that no one was shouting orders, that men just drifted in from every direction, without appearing to be in much of a hurry about it, and that the 100-odd men sprawled about in the pasture looked as unlike an army as anything you might conceive of, but nevertheless they were carrying out the purpose with a calm that astonished me. They were where they had to be, with time enough to spare. There were a number of men who wore the blue and white ribbon of the militia officer on their hats. They kept coming to Solomon Chandler, who sat on a bit of stone wall with my cousin Dover from Lincoln Town. Cousin Dover was trying to make a tally in a small black notebook he carried in his pocket, checking off names with a quill pen. His ink was balanced on a rock, and he sat on the stone wall as serious as businesslike, as if he were in the store back in Lincoln and going over his accounts. Meanwhile, Israel Thatcher, the news carrier from Medford, was selling his papers and gathering news to piece together the story of the massacre, questioning everyone who had been on the Common. He attempted to borrow Cousin Dover's pen and ink and notebook, arguing that an accurate history of the day was more important than any muster book. But Cousin Dover informed him that he would do better to wait until the day was over before he wrote its history. And unless someone had enough sense to bother with the muster book, it might make poor history indeed. Further, he implied that he didn't think very much of a news carrier who would come out on a day like this without some kind of writing materials. Kind of like coming to class or coming to school without your pens. We ever heard that before? Cousin Simmons had a cold meat pie in his jacket pocket, and he insisted that I share it with him. I tried to explain that Solomon Chandler had shared a whole provision bag with me, but he would not be satisfied. He just knew that I'd feel better if I ate something, so I took half of the pie just to please him. As a matter of fact, after the first bite, I enjoyed it thoroughly. I never considered Goody Simmons to be much of a cook, but I must say that she did an old-fashioned meat pie as well as anyone. I guess Moses is dead, he said to me. There's no doubt, is there? No, sir. They brought him into the house. Who did? Mother and Granny and Cousin Rebecca. I told him about the smokehouse and how Levi had found me there. Then he took hold of my hands and he told me, plain and quiet, that while nothing would ever replace Moses Cooper in my heart, I could turn to him just as I would to a father. It meant a good deal to me to hear him say that, because he was not just saying it, he meant it. It wasn't very easy to get to know Joseph Simmons. He was one of those big, heavy-muscled, slow-speaking men who seemed to think, though, every word they who seemed to think through every word they uttered. But once he set his mind to something, he did it, no matter what price he had to pay. If he gave his word, he kept his word. He knew what had happened on the common, and running away was far worse for him than it was for me, since he was a grown man. We're going to fight them today, Adam, he said to me. I know. Things happen in fighting. Yes, sir. I guess the most terrible and unexpected things happen. I pray to God to spare us both, Adam. Amen to that. But no one knows. As Jehovah wills it, so it will be. But if anything does happen, I want you to tell Ruth and be kind and considerate of her, Adam. A girl is a frail thing and not easy in the world until she has a home and a family of her own. I promised him, though I couldn't think of Ruth Simmons as a frail thing. She was one of the strongest and healthiest girls in our town. Take another sip here. We heard gunfire. It was distant and faint, and in the direction of Concord. But it brought everyone in the pasture to his feet. We stood there listening and staring. Then a rider came across the fields, spurring his horse, sailing over the stone wall, pulling up hard and sharp at the pasture, with everybody crowding around him to hear the news that he brought. Church bells were ringing again. It was hard to say exactly where the bells were, but you could hear them from the south and from the west. The rider brought news that the British Army was in Concord. Most everything had been taken away from there and hidden. Only some hogsheads of wheat flour left. Who would have dreamed that the redcoats would smash them up and stew them in flour, strew the flour all over the place? But according to the rider, that's exactly what they had done. The redcoat officers were sitting outside of the inn, drinking everything and paying for nothing, making a great picnic out of the whole thing. There were no men to speak of left in Concord, only women and children. But the gunfire, demanded Solomon Chandler. What of the gunfire, man? The rider didn't know. He had only heard the gunfire as he approached us. But he did know that there had been talk among the British of destroying the North Bridge, and the militia were on the west bank of the river. There might have been a fight at the river. There was more gunfire while we questioned him. Scattered bursts, then a single shot popping lightly, so faint that it was hardly possible to define them with any certainty. Well, what's their plans? Do they leave Concord? He didn't know. He pleaded his thirst, and someone handed him a water bottle. The day was turning hot and preparing to be the hottest day of the year until then. Do you have the nerve to go back there? He asked. He did. He nodded his head vigorously. His horse was a beautiful chestnut gelding. He was about 19 years old and proud of his riding. He said that if it had to be, he'd ride through the Redcoat Army. Never you mind such tricks. Well, what did he want him to do? Go back and listen for when they march. And then cut into the road and ride down before them, yelling in alarm. You're a young man. You've got a good set of lungs. Well, don't shoot me by mistake. Go on with you. He rode away, waving back to us. Solomon Chandler stood up at the stone wall. Hi, Autumn. Solomon Chandler stood up at the stone wall, and the men gathered round. I didn't count them then, but I am sure there were well over 100 in the pasture. One man had 200 dogs with him. I'm sorry, 2 hunting dogs with him. I've told you guys before, the text in this, I got to get a new copy of this book. The text in this book is fading, and I apologize. Send the dogs home, neighbor, Chandler said. There's no need to flush what we hunt. It raised a laugh, and I could see how much they enjoyed this old man. He stood up on the stone wall, tall and skinny as a fence rail, his hands in his pocket, his long rifle slung over his back, his pipe in his mouth. Then he tapped out the pipe on the back of his hand. And he said, well, here we are, neighbors. And whoever would have thought it would have come to fighting on a fine Middlesex morning like this one. But it has. It has. The Redcoats danced, didn't they? And now they got to pay the piper. It wouldn't be all proper to let them go home and exact no payment. I know that the Reverend could say all and more that must be said, but when he does, I do hope that he will turn to Exodus 21, for it is written there, "He that smite a man so that he die shall be surely put to death. And if a man lie not in wait, but God deliver him into his hand, then I will appoint thee a place whither he shall flee. But if a man comes presumptuously upon his neighbor to slay him with guile, thou shalt take him from mine altar, that he may die." Amen came from across the pasture. Amen. Now, how many of you are riflemen? Raise your weapons. About 20 men raised their rifles, holding them over their heads for Solomon Chandler to see. "Good," the old man said. "Go over to my left and separate yourselves. I'll be the captain with you. And Joshua Dover with the muskets and bird guns, unless anyone wants to propose it differently. If they do, I'm willing to hear." "Why can't we stay together, Solomon?" "You answer that, son. A musket gun carries 100 paces. A rifle carries 400 paces. That calls for two different kinds of tactics entirely. Now, just let me explain what I have in mind. Consider the 5 miles of road between here and Lexington. It seems plain to me that the Redcoats are going to march down that stretch of road. It would be 5 miles 5 miles more by way of Lincoln to Watertown, and no sense whatsoever. So it's safe to presume they'll take the road to the north of us. All that 5 miles to Lexington and 10 miles more to Charleston will give them no peace whatsoever. At least half the stretch of the road is blinded with stone wall. We'll lie down behind that wall and we'll make them mighty uncomfortable." I wondered, could you be shot down and run away in such fear as we had on the Common, and then fight and win? And all of it on the same day. It was one thing to see the Redcoats in the distance, and something else to have them close up on you. I had to tell them I was still not the one. I went with Cousin Simmons in a file of men walking towards the road, and it didn't seem possible that we were at war, not even with the shots popping like Indian corn in the distance. The Reverend was with us. He had a gun now, a bag of shot, a bottle of powder, and under the day's growth of whiskers in his face, he was sad and he was lonely. Solomon Chandler came over to wish me Godspeed. "Prime your gun careful. Don't fire unless the man's upon you. Count his buttons. A gun like yours won't stop a man at more than 30 paces. "Yes, sir," I said. "I'll heed your words." "Take no pleasure in it. Let it hurt, but become hard in the sorrow." "Would you tell him that?" the Reverend asked. "And you too, Reverend. I tell you that. We'll weep for them, but they brought the killing upon us, now us to them." "God help us all," the Reverend said. "I say amen to that. We fight in God's cause." "Nobody fights in God's cause," the Reverend said harshly. "Isn't it enough to kill in freedom's name? No one kills in God's cause. He can only ask God's forgiveness." The old man heard this respectfully. "As you say, Reverend, I would like to dispute it somewhat, but there ain't time." Then he turned off with his riflemen to find a hummock overlooking the road, while we filed through a scrub of woods to the stone wall that lined the road. We took our places on the blind side of the wall, a man every few yards, stretching down along the road to where it curved out of sight, and with the road itself not 10 paces from where we were. "We'll keep down after we shoot," Cousin Simmons said, "and get out. Then we can take other places down the road. It's just death to try to remain here on the roadway full of British regulars." Most everyone agreed with him, and then Cousin Joshua came down the wall to check our position. He said the same thing. "How long to wait, Joshua?" the Reverend asked. The Reverend was on one side of me, Cousin Simmons on the other. "I hear the shooting plainer, don't you?" We were sitting on the top of the wall. It was strange to see men sitting there as far as the wall stretched. I couldn't remember seeing anything like it. I'd never seen anything like it before. Plainer, I think. It was. The pop, pop, pop of gunfire was becoming louder. It no longer sounded like Indian corn. My heart began to hammer wildly, and suddenly I felt that I would burst if I didn't pass water. Do it here, Cousin Simmons said. Can't with the Reverend watching. Don't be a fool, boy. Don't you think the Reverend does the same thing? He'll be doing it he'll be doing it enough before the day's through. Go ahead and put modesty away, Adam, the Reverend agreed. And I did it. It was woefully hot, the sweat pouring down my face. Cousin Simmons said why I didn't take off my coat. I replied that I couldn't, because I might lose it in the excitement. And it was the very best jacket coat I ever owned, and brand new in the bargain. And you wore it last night, Cousin Simmons cried. The Reverend burst into laughter. It was the first time any of us had laughed since the morning began. All right, let's do one more page. The rider from Concord was as good as his word. He came spurring and whooping down the road, his horse kicking upon clouds of dust and shouting, "They're a comin'! By God, they're a comin', they are!" We heard him before he even showed. And we heard him yelling after he was out of sight. Solomon Chandler hadn't misjudged the strength of his lungs, not at all. I think you could have heard him a mile away. He was bursting at every seam with importance. I have observed that being up upon a horse changes the whole character of a man. And when a very small man is on the saddle, he'd like as not prefer to eat his meals there. That's understandable, and I appreciate the sentiment. As for this rider, I never saw him before or afterwards, and never saw him dismounted. So whether he stood tall or short in his shoes, I can't say. But I do know that he gave his tone and his distinction. The last thing in the world that resembled a war was our line of farmers and storekeepers and mechanics perched on top of the stone wall. And this dashing rider made us feel a good deal sharper and more alert to the situation. We came down off the wall as if he had toppled all of us, and we crouched behind it. I've heard people talk with contempt about the British regulars, but that only proves that a lot of people talk about things of which they are deplorably ignorant. Oh, that's true today, too. People talk about a lot of things that they are deplorably ignorant about. Whatsoever we felt about the Redcoats, we respected them in terms of their trade, which was killing. And I know that I, myself, was nauseated with apprehension and fear, that my hands were soaking wet where they held my gun. I wanted to wipe my flint, but I didn't dare to. The state my hands were in, just as I, I wanted to wipe my flint, but I didn't dare. The state my hands were in, just as I didn't dare to do anything about priming. The gun would fire or not, just a chance willed. I put a lot more trust in my two legs than in the gun, because the most important thing I had learned about war was that you could run away and survive to talk about it. The gunfire, which was so near that it seemed just a piece up the road, stopped for long enough for me to count to 20. And in that brief interval, a redcoat officer came tearing down the road, whipping his horse fit to kill. I don't know whether he was after our rider, who had gone by a minute before, or whether he was simply scouting condition. But when he passed by, a musket roared, and he reared his horse, swung it around, and began to whip it back in the direction from which he had come. He was a fine and showy rider, but his skill was wasted on us. From above me and somewhere behind me, a rifle cracked. The redcoat officer collapsed like a punctured bolster, and the horse reared and threw him from the saddle, except that one booted foot caught in the stirrup. Half crazed by the weight and dragging in the dust and the heat, the horse leaped our wall, bashing out the rider's brains against it, leaving him lying there among us, while the horse crashed through the brush. It was my initiation to war in the insane symphony war plays. For what had happened on the common was only terror and flight. But this grinning, broking head, not 10 feet away from me, was the sharp definition of what my reality had become. All right. Wow. Well, Adam, I think, is just about to really get his real, true first taste of war. Another great job reading tonight. We're really making our way through this. I think we should be done by Friday night. We don't have that much more to read, about 50 more pages to read. Okay, so let me wet my whistle and let's talk about some current events. So, a lot of interesting things that I saw in the news today. And you know, good and bad. So the consensus is that social distancing, it looks like, is working, right? However, people are not apparently socially distancing as they should. Here's a prime example. Last night we talked about the USS Comfort came into New York City. It's a big hospital boat, 1,000 beds, all this awesome stuff. It's a Navy boat. Well, what happened was thousands of people came out of their homes, went down to, well, I guess it's the Hudson River on that side, right? Went down to the Hudson and started taking pictures of the boat, and they all were next to one another. Not good, right? In the city that is the epicenter of, this virus in our country, thousands of people are literally lined up shoulder to shoulder to one another. So Governor Cuomo today, he had some pretty strong words in his press conference. I was watching it on channel, I can't remember what channel, but I was watching it and they cut away. After like 10 minutes, they cut away, and I tried to find it, and it seemed as though the local news stations at least kind of got bored with him. They did go back later, but he talked today about, number one, his brother, who is a reporter for CNN, now has it. Excuse me. His brother now has it. And what he said some pretty strong words, not about his brother, but he said that, New Yorkers, he said, if you're not practicing social distancing right now, and he said this word, he said, you're being stupid, and you're being selfish. And, when you are not doing the things that we're suggesting that you do, you're bringing that stupidity down upon everyone. You're risking everybody else. And he's asking that New Yorkers be less selfish, right? Be less selfish. The federal government, the New York State government has said, we need to do these things. Do them. Please do them. So pretty strong words from our governor. Across the country, there are 180,000 cases of coronavirus. 3,600 people have died. Now, I saw right before I came on the live YouTube channel here that the federal government, is saying that anywhere from 100,000 to 240,000 Americans could die from this by the time that it's all over with. So there are some hot spots in the country. New York, obviously, is one of them. And Louisiana, New Orleans is one of them as well. And I saw today that Texas state police officers are now lined up along the main roads that go from Louisiana to Texas. And they're actually stopping people from Louisiana that are coming in, but if people that are from Texas and they are coming back in from Louisiana, I guess they're requiring them to self-quarantine for 14 days. And I guess there was A lot of controversy about state troopers in Rhode Island pulling over people with New York license plates. So, we're one big country. We're made of 50 states, and people are getting fearful, right? They know where the hot spots are, and they don't want people bringing this virus here and there. Uh, okay, excuse me. So the other thing I saw was, we're a country, we're states, well, we're counties, and we're towns, and we're villages. And now in Saratoga County, if they catch you not social distancing, they're going to ticket you for $250. So I don't know, maybe to some people that's not a lot of money, but Saratoga is starting to get more serious about it. New Orleans, like I said before, in Louisiana is now an epicenter, and that is a big place. It's a big touristy place, and a lot of people travel there. It's also, I don't know if you guys know this, but New Orleans has become a big port town after, was it Hurricane Katrina, I believe, that devastated New Orleans. After that, when they rebuilt, New Orleans has become a big port for cruises. So New York does a lot more cruises. Boston does more cruises. Maryland, right? Baltimore, Maryland, you can get a cruise boat out of there. But one of the big growing places for people to cruise in and out of is New Orleans. And that's one of the places where it's really starting to take off. I do have some bad news. Maybe it's not going to be super bad news for you guys, but the Great Escape Resort is going to remain closed for a while. They are saying that they don't see themselves opening back up until probably mid-May, and they possibly might be looking at postponing the opening of the Great Escape itself, which I think the Great Escape, I want to say it typically opens Memorial Day weekend. So they're planning that there's probably going to be excuse me, a postponement. And again, that's one of the things that we talked about earlier in the week when it affects the economy. I mean, of course, the Great Escape will probably survive opening up a little bit late, but there's a great place for teenagers to get jobs. So a lot of those jobs that are often available to teens, well, they may not be there right at the start of the summer. Okay, so our New York State budget. I know we talked about this earlier in the week. The New York State budget does not go on a calendar year. It goes on what's called a fiscal year. So the people that represent us, our state assemblymen, our state senators, and the governor, come up with and approve a budget by April 1st. Our tax dollars, right, are collected. Oh, excuse me. Thought I was going to yawn and sneeze at the same time. So our tax dollars are collected, right, and all these services are put out. And right now, because of everything that's been going on, the Assembly and the Senate and the governor have not really truly been able to negotiate and come up with a budget. So this has happened plenty of times where the budget is not passed. It doesn't mean the government shuts down, but what the Assembly is talking about doing right now, and the governor and the Senate, is basically kind of creating a temporary measure to keep everything rolling, keep all government services going right now. But if they don't, right, if they don't have some kind of plan in place by the end of the day tomorrow, at least 120,000 New York State workers are not going to get paid this week. So that's something, again, it's a very odd time, I think, and it's something that I guess I'm trying to not think about that much. But there are a lot of people out there that really, I think, they have their jobs, and they're still being paid through this, um, and they're going to get some help from the government, right? There, everybody's going to get the stimulus check, and there are a lot of people out there that I think are just, they're losing everything, right? They're losing their business, they're losing their big business. They're losing their, possibly, I can't pay for my car. I can't pay for my home. And the government has done some things to push off foreclosures and push off evictions, right? But I don't know. I think some people are not. I don't know what you guys think about this, and I'd be interested to hear, and I want to hear what you think. But it seems to me like everything that we're going through right now, some people just seem kind of clueless. Like it's like, how do you live through 9/11 and you just don't really know what's going on? How, if you lived, through Pearl Harbor, are you just kind of totally oblivious, right, to what's happening? And as the days go on, I keep finding more and more people that just seem to be like, what's going on? What's happening here? Right? And that just kind of shocks me. I don't know what you guys think about that. But it seems like, everybody, there are a lot of people that have changed every single thing in their life to get through this and to help other people. And that's awesome. But there's still this like group of people in our society that are like, they've got the horse blinders on and they just don't know what's going on. Whether that's by choice, I don't know. I don't know, but I'm kind of boggled by it. So here's what I want to tell you. A lot of people out there are trying to take advantage of this situation. So there are a lot of robocalls. Apparently, there are people that are doing the robocalls that are inviting you to join a unique opportunity to get into a work from home software thing, and you just have to put down $500 and blah 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 blah, and they're scamming people left and right. So unfortunately, there are a lot of awesome people out there that are doing really great things, and they're doing a lot of awesome stuff for their neighbors. But then there's just this group of people out there that are just predators, and they're preying on people that just have nothing or very little, and they're just trying to take what they can. Um, One of the things I wanted to talk to you guys about today. Oh, good news. Here's some good news. The Olympics are going to happen. So if you are a big Olympic fan, apparently, excuse me, things in Japan are headed in the direction that they need to head in. And the Olympics have now been pushed to July 23rd through August 8th. So, yeah, Sydney, that's a really good point. Sydney says, I think people are acting oblivious because they don't want to face reality. You know what, Sydney? They could be doing the turtle, right? They're just pulling their head in the shell, and they're just going to sit there and they're just going to ride it out. And maybe that's it. Maybe they're going to do that. Maybe that's better for us. Maybe that's, if people are going to be that apathetic, maybe that's what we need. I don't know. I'm not too sure. But it just kind of surprises me. I'm getting emails from students who I haven't heard from, and we're in week 2 of this, and they're saying, we have to do work. We don't even know what's going on. So it's kind of like, how do you not know what's going on here, right? I mean, honestly, I don't know. But anyways, good news. We are going to have the Olympics. Okay, so oil prices, right? Oil prices. They are plummeting, right? They're the lowest they've been in, I don't even remember. I didn't write it down. I want to say 18, 19 years or something like that, right? Somebody told me that I saw gas for 2819 yesterday. 219. Somebody said they saw gas for 208 today. So why is that bad? Economists, when they look at how healthy the economy is, plummeting oil prices can often be the sign of a bad economy. So, why is that so? It doesn't make sense. It would make more sense that gas prices are low when things are good. Well, right now, people are scared to leave their house. People are not going on vacations. People are not flying. Excuse me. People are not taking cruises. So think about gas companies in our country right now. This is when people are driving. Hey, it's a nice weekend. We're going to drive up to Lake George. Hey, we're going to drive up to Lake Placid. Hey, we're going to drive to see Crazy Uncle Joe out in Syracuse or whatever, right? So people are doing that more. Well, guess what? Now they aren't. So an incentive for people to do that, right, is to keep gas prices low. The gas companies want to try to entice you to go to fill up the car and take a drive. So when gas prices are low, it could be a sign of a bad economy. And a lot of people are worried about that right now. This is the worst quarter in stock market in the past 12 years. And with plummeting oil prices, we could be heading into, and what we talked about earlier in the week, we could be heading into a recession. So, we don't want gas prices to be $12 a gallon. But when we see them start to drop very quickly, it can, and that's what I should have said earlier, it can be the sign of, an economic downturn, which certainly is what's happening right now. Some more good news. Apparently, 5,000 masks were donated to Albany Med today. They got to Albany Med, which is certainly going to help the people there. But there's also some real bad news at Albany Med today. 45 staff members today alone at Albany Med tested positive for the coronavirus. So, that is in my opinion, that might be the scariest news that we've heard so far. Not that I'm going to necessarily lose any sleep over it tonight, and I'm certainly not saying everybody should be scared about this news, but that's a lot of workers to test positive in one day. I mean, certainly Albany Med has thousands and thousands of people that are working there, right? And the thousands of people that are probably working there around the clock. But when 45 people in one day test positive, that's a little scary. Now, the other thing is, and I didn't bring that up earlier, is apparently the governor said today that they're getting close to being able to have, and I think this is what would be, this would be a deal breaker, right? This would be a game changer. He's claiming that we're getting close to a test that you could mail in. So basically, if we've been social distancing, if we've been doing our due diligence, if we've been staying out of everybody else's faces here, right? And we get this test, we mail it in, bam, they get it, and apparently, they're going to be able to turn these tests around real quick, and then they're going to be able to call you and say, "Hey, guess what? Everybody in your house, you're fine, you're looking good." Okay, quarantine that up, right? Keep what you've been doing is working. Lock it down. And then other people, they're going to be able to say, "Hey, listen, here's where you are with this virus right now. And we want to try to get you some help." So I think that would really, really, really be one heck of a game changer for us if they can start putting out this mail-in test. And I think that they're also still working on these drive-in tests. But I think that they've got to start. That's one of those things that, like, where I live in a rural community, that's where I think it could help us. Like, they're saying that still today in Schoharie County, there are only 5 people that have tested positive in Schoharie County. However, it's only 3 people that actually live here. One person works for SUNY Cobleskill and works there, but lives maybe in Delaware County. And the other one was a person that is on campus at SUNY Cobleskill, but it's trapped right there. They're trapped there now because I think that they're a foreign student. They're there from another country, and they don't have the ability to get home now. So we actually only have 3 residents of Schoharie County that have tested positive. However, a lot of people out here haven't been tested yet. So as far as we know, the whole county could have it. I doubt it. I think it unlikely. But we'll see. All right. So one of the things I wanted to try today was to do, and again, my friends, if you guys have any questions, please throw them up there. I think I got everything I wanted to talk to you guys about. But I wanted today to do a little rundown of this day in history, right? March 31st, 2020. What other awesome things were happening? What other historic things were happening on this day in history? And certainly, my friends, whether you know it or not, we are, living through a very historic moment, right? I think that I know that one day, and it probably won't be for a while, but one day in the history books, there is going to be, talk about what we're going through right now. I have no doubt in my mind. I think that this will without a doubt make it into the books. So in 1889, and no, I was not alive then, Sydney, the Eiffel Tower opened, right? The Eiffel Tower opened. So 1889, that is on my bucket list. I don't know if any of you have ever seen it or how many of you would like to see it. I would love one day to travel to Paris. I would like to see France. I would like to go to Normandy. I would certainly like to see the Pyrenees, which are the mountains in between France and Spain. But I would very much like to see the Eiffel Tower. I'd love to go to the Louvre, right, which is the art museum in Paris. But 100, what would that be? That would be 131 years ago on this day the Eiffel Tower opened. So in social studies class, we talked about, or this week, you should be going through our imperialism unit, right? This is a moment in time when America looks out at the world and says, hey, you know what? Tour de France, sure. This is a time when we want to go out there and we want to gobble up some colonies, right? We're talking about the second half of the 1800s. We are going to become a military power, but we're also becoming a powerful industrialized country. And when these American businesses build up, well, we want to take that stuff and we want to sell it to the world. So, there are a good part of people, or a good amount of people, in the country that want us to become an imperialist nation. And one of the first things that kind of opens up this door is in 1854. So on this day in 1854, Commodore Matthew Perry, he had gone and traveled to Japan with this nice, big, strong U.S. Navy. And he really kind of forces them to sign this trade agreement. Japan is at the time a pretty backwards country. If you remember from your global history, they close up for a very long period of time, and they are sheltered. They intentionally shelter themselves from the world. They've opened up for about, at this point, it's probably about 65, 70 years. So they're still behind the curve on things, and we intimidate them with our big navy, and Commodore Matthew Perry forces them to sign this trade agreement. The other thing that happens, and remember, if you have a question or a comment or anything, guys, throw it up there. But I found this little tidbit, which I thought was pretty cool. Abigail Adams, who is someone that I certainly don't know enough about, but she is a person that I would, in all my free time, I would really love to learn more about her. Abigail Adams, the wife of our second president, John Adams, she writes to him on this day in 1776 that as this revolution begins and as our new nation is being born, she says, remember the ladies. So apparently she was a very, not apparently, she was an outspoken woman, but her husband was very progressive in that he, let her, and she certainly had a great influence on him and on his political career. And there's a great HBO special called John Adams. Guess who it's about? And in that show, the way they portray the marriage there is that certainly she had a great influence over him, and a lot of what the decisions he ended up making. A lot of he was, I think, a little different at the time in that he really considered. Not only did he listen to his wife, but it truly influenced him what she said. So, 4 pretty cool things this day in history, and we'll talk more about things in our history tomorrow. And I think we're going to, by Friday, be done with our book, which means hopefully on Sunday night we can start a new one. Again, my plan is to start reading The Jungle with you guys. So excited to read that with you. And that really brings us right up to date, right? We just talked about that in class. So with that, great night, awesome night of reading, good current events. I think our current events were pretty serious tonight. I've been actively searching to try to, give you guys a little bit more cheerful news. Like, I don't know. A bunch of puppies were rescued, and I don't know. A kid rescued an infant from a well or something like that. But right now, it's a little tough to find that type of news. But I am out there, and I am trying to find it for you guys. So I hope everybody's doing well. I hope everybody's healthy. I am going to try to be a part of. Oh, that's what I wanted to throw out there. I did, I think, throw this out there last night, but yes, MHS TV is back on the air. And I think by 8 a.m., they are releasing the show. And I liked it. I really liked what they did this morning. I thought it was very creative. And somebody brought up that, and God bless those guys, they really try hard. They always seem to have difficulties with all their sound and everything like that. But the show they put together this morning was super creative, and everybody could hear it. And kudos to Nico and Charles and, everybody else that's a part of the morning news. But they're going to be doing that every day of the week. I hope you guys are taking part in Spirit Week. Today, I think, was Profession Day. And I think tomorrow is College Day. And I've been trying to think if I have any Sienna clothes, Sienna shirts. I used to have a really nice Sienna sweatshirt, and I don't think I do. But I'll try to dig one up. Maybe I'll paint my face green and gold, the Sienna colors. But I think that's about all I have for you guys for tonight. So again, thank you very much for showing up. Maybe one night this week, I'll try to get a little K-pop out there again, a little Korean pop music. I've not gone back to it since we We listened to it the other night. I might be brave enough tomorrow to listen to some more. So, again, I hope everybody's doing well. I hope everybody's keeping their head up, keep your chin up. It's a marathon, it's not a sprint. Take everything one day at a time. And thanks for joining me. If you guys need anything, don't be afraid to hit up office hours, and don't be afraid to email me. I miss you guys, and I hope to see you soon. Be good.